The stage was set for the final act. January 1945. The Eastern Front was a frozen hellscape where the very concept of mercy had died years earlier. The Red Army, once dismissed as primitive and disorganized, now stood as the most powerful land force in human history. For months, Adolf Hitler had dismissed the mounting evidence of impending catastrophe. He labeled intelligence reports as defeatist propaganda, court-martialed officers who suggested tactical withdrawals, and surrounded himself with sycophants who echoed his dangerous fantasies. He was a man waiting for a miracle while standing on the tracks of an oncoming train. But on January 12, 1945, the timetable of destiny could no longer be ignored. The clock had run out on the Third Reich. The Soviet Vistula Oder offensive began with a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of Central Europe. This was not a conventional military operation. It was an act of biblical retribution. 2 million Soviet soldiers emerged from the frozen mists, supported by over 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces that fired in a coordinated symphony of destruction. The initial bombardment lasted for hours, transforming German defensive positions into lunar landscapes. When the Red Army infantry advanced, they did so behind a rolling artillery barrage that moved forward at a predetermined pace, a technique perfected through years of brutal warfare. The German front lines didn't just collapse, they evaporated. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front moved with a speed and coordination that defied all German military doctrine. They covered 300 miles in just 2 weeks, a rate of advance that surpassed even the German Blitzkrieg of 1941. Entire German armies simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. The 4th Panzer Army was overrun, the 9th Army was encircled and systematically dismantled, and what remained of Army Group A was pushed back to the Oder River. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, a foreign army stood on German soil in overwhelming force, and this time they had come not to negotiate but to exterminate. Inside the insulated world of the Führerbunker, the initial reaction followed a familiar pattern of denial and rage. When the first reports arrived, Hitler screamed about treason and cowardice. He pointed at maps that had become historical artifacts and ordered counterattacks from divisions that existed only on paper. He accused his generals of betraying the German people, of deliberately sabotaging his genius. For 3 days, he maintained this performance, a theatrical display of fury designed to intimidate reality itself. But beneath the performative anger, something unprecedented was occurring. The sheer, undeniable scale of the disaster began to penetrate even his formidable psychological defenses. The reports kept coming, each more desperate than the last. They spoke of entire regiments surrendering without a fight, of panzer divisions being swallowed whole by the Soviet tide, of command structures collapsing into anarchic confusion. The Eastern Front, which had stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was no longer a line but a collection of isolated doomed pockets. The reality was inescapable. The war in the East had been lost in a matter of days. The moment of truth arrived during a late-night situation conference on January 27th. The bunker's atmosphere was thick with smoke, fear, and exhaustion. An operations officer, his voice trembling, was explaining how the Soviet spearheads had already reached the Oder River and were establishing bridgeheads on the western bank, the final geographical barrier before Berlin itself. Hitler, who had been staring blankly at the situation map, suddenly fell completely silent. The constant Parkinson's-induced tremor in his left hand stilled. His shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. He looked from the frantic officer to the map, his eyes tracing the enormous red arrows representing Soviet advances that had already carved deep into German territory. And then he spoke words that his inner circle had never imagined they would hear. His voice was low, stripped of all its usual theatrical energy and power, reduced to a hollow whisper. "Es ist verloren," he said. "The war is lost." For several seconds, there was absolute terrifying silence in the bunker. The architect of the war, the man who had dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich, had finally admitted the truth. The god had confessed his mortality, but this moment of shocking clarity was immediately corrupted by the very pathology that had created the disaster. The admission was not a prelude to surrender or rational damage control. It was a transition into something far more dangerous: apocalyptic nihilism. Almost as soon as the words left his mouth, the delusion returned with renewed force. "Wenn der Krieg verloren geht," he continued, his voice regaining its fanatical edge, "wird auch das Volk verloren sein." If the war is lost, then the people are also lost. His personal realization became a death sentence for the entire German nation. Within hours, he was issuing directives for a total scorched earth policy. Factories, bridges, power plants, food stores, the entire infrastructure that sustained German civilian life was to be destroyed. He explicitly stated that the German people had proven themselves weak and therefore deserved their fate. The man who knew he was doomed had made the conscious decision to drag 60 million people down with him. This was no longer about military strategy or political ideology. It was about orchestrating the most spectacular suicide note in history. To fully comprehend the seismic significance of January 1945, one must first understand the elaborate fortress of denial Hitler had constructed around his psyche. By the end of 1944, the strategic situation was catastrophic by any rational measure. In the West, while the German counter-offensive in the Ardennes had temporarily stunned the Allies, it had ultimately failed, bleeding the Wehrmacht of its last strategic reserves of men and material. The Western Allies now stood firmly on Germany's doorstep, their material superiority so overwhelming that German commanders could only hope to delay, not prevent, their advance. In the east, while the front had temporarily stabilized along the Vistula River after the Warsaw Uprising, every intelligence indicator pointed to a massive Soviet buildup for a winter offensive of unprecedented scale. The German intelligence apparatus on the Eastern Front, the Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, under the meticulous Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, had performed remarkably accurate work. Through aerial reconnaissance, signal intercepts, and prisoner interrogations, Gehlen's team had correctly identified the timing, location, and overwhelming strength of the impending Soviet attack. His detailed reports, complete with unit identifications and strength estimates, landed regularly on Hitler's desk. They were systematically ignored, dismissed as the defeatist ramblings of staff officers who lacked his revolutionary will. Hitler's rejection of reality was not mere stubbornness, it was a fundamental tenet of his leadership philosophy. He genuinely believed that willpower could overcome material facts, that the triumph of the will was not just propaganda, but an operational principle. His entire strategy in late 1944 revolved around what he privately called Das Wunder des Hause Brandenburg, the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, a historical reference to the sudden death of Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna in 1762, which miraculously saved Frederick the Great from certain defeat in the 7 Years' War. Hitler was literally waiting for a deus ex machina, a political miracle where the grand alliance between the capitalist West and communist Soviet Union would shatter overnight. This profound self-deception was actively enabled and reinforced by the courtier culture that dominated his inner circle. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels consistently fed him inflated reports of new wonder weapons, like the V-2 rockets and Messerschmitt 262 jets, promising they would turn the tide. Armaments Minister Albert Speer, while privately pessimistic, continued to deliver miraculously high production figures. Most dangerously, figures like Martin Bormann controlled access to the Führer, ensuring that dissenting voices or bad news were filtered out before they could reach him. He existed in a perfectly engineered echo chamber where the only voices allowed were those that confirmed his preconceptions. This environment transformed strategic miscalculations into catastrophic delusions. The loss of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration the previous summer was blamed solely on the treachery of field marshals like Bush, never on Soviet operational genius. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was attributed to the incompetence of commanders like Model and Dietrich, never to the simple lack of fuel, air cover, or numerical inferiority. This collective delusion was rooted in a fundamental and fatal misjudgment of the Soviet Union. Hitler and his inner circle, shaped by their racial ideology, consistently viewed the Soviets as Untermenschen, subhuman. They believed the Soviet state was a fragile construct, its industrial capacity primitive, its manpower reserves nearly exhausted after the colossal losses of 1941 to 1943. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Through a Herculean effort of evacuation and industrial mobilization, Soviet war production had not only recovered, but had dwarfed that of Germany. In 1944, the USSR was producing over 2,000 T-34 tanks per month, compared to Germany's 500 Panthers and Tigers. The Red Army had evolved from the disorganized mob of 1941 into a professional, battle-hardened force led by commanders like Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky, who had mastered the complex art of deep battle operations. The German military, by contrast, was a hollow shell. Its elite units had been annihilated. Its new recruits were poorly trained boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm. And its equipment, while technologically advanced in some areas, was unreliable and produced in insufficient numbers. The stage was not set for a miracle, it was set for a collision between a delusional fantasy and an unforgiving reality. The Vistula-Oder offensive was the moment these two forces met, and the fantasy was vaporized in the ensuing firestorm. The Vistula-Oder offensive stands as one of the most decisive military operations in history, the anvil upon which the fate of the Third Reich was finally and irrevocably smashed. It represented the ultimate maturation of Soviet military science, a perfect synthesis of overwhelming force, meticulous planning, and strategic deception. The Soviets had learned from their previous offensives, understanding that breakthrough was not enough. The exploitation had to be immediate and relentless to prevent the Germans from establishing new defensive lines. The preparation was staggering in its scale and detail. For months, the Stavka, Soviet High Command, had been shifting entire armies from the quiet sectors of the front, moving them hundreds of miles under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence. Vast stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and rations were accumulated in hidden forward depots. Engineers built dozens of fake bridges and erected thousands of dummy tanks and artillery pieces to mislead German reconnaissance about the true point of the main attack. The concentration of force achieved was unlike anything witnessed before on the Eastern Front, or perhaps in any theater of the war. Along the main axis of advance, the Soviets achieved crushing numerical superiority, 5-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks and self-propelled guns, and an almost unimaginable 20-1 in artillery and mortars. The initial bombardment on the morning of January 12th was not a mere artillery barrage. It was a continuous, earth-shattering event that lasted for hours. The fire rampart technique was employed, a rolling wall of explosives that moved forward at a predetermined pace, literally clearing a path for the infantry and tanks that followed closely behind. German forward positions were not just damaged, they were utterly obliterated. Command posts were destroyed, communication lines were severed, and reserves were pinned down in their assembly areas. When the Soviet infantry and armor advanced, they did not encounter a cohesive defense. They encountered a leaderless, shell-shocked void. The German 4th Panzer Army, holding the critical sector of the front, was simply overrun. Its divisions were cut off and destroyed in a matter of days. The 9th Army suffered an even worse fate. It was outflanked, encircled in the Warsaw Pocket, and systematically dismantled. The speed of the Soviet advance became the key psychological weapon. Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front covered the 100 miles from the Vistula to the industrial city of Krakow in just 4 days. Zhukov's forces advanced even faster, their mobile groups bypassing all centers of resistance and driving straight for the Oder River. German High Command, the OKH, lost all contact with its shattered formations. Situation maps became useless historical documents within hours of being printed. The very concept of a front line dissolved into meaningless abstraction. The reports that managed to reach the Wolf's Lair, and later the Führerbunker in Berlin, were fragmented, hysterical, and often contradictory. But they all conveyed the same terrifying truth. The Eastern Front, which had consumed millions of lives over 4 years, had ceased to exist as a coherent military entity in less than 2 weeks. Hitler's response to this avalanche of disaster was a textbook case of catastrophic micromanagement, born of total disconnect from reality. As his empire collapsed at a breathtaking pace, he retreated further into tactical details, focusing on the fate of individual regiments and battalion-level engagements. He issued hold-at-all-costs orders to units whose positions were already dozens of miles behind the advancing Soviet spearheads. He forbade any form of tactical withdrawal, a policy that had proven disastrous at Stalingrad and was now being repeated on a continental scale. The few remaining operational reserves, like the elite Großdeutschland Panzer Corps, were wasted in piecemeal, uncoordinated counterattacks that were annihilated before they could even make contact with the main Soviet forces. His constant interference and refusal to delegate paralyzed his field commanders, who were now more terrified of Hitler's irrational wrath than they were of the Soviet armies closing in on them. This period marked the final complete breakdown of the professional German officer corps. Talented commanders like Guderian, the chief of the General Staff, were reduced to the status of glorified messengers, forced to relay insane orders to armies that had already been wiped from the board. The sophisticated machinery of the German war machine, once the most efficient and feared in the world, was now being operated by a delusional madman who was systematically and deliberately dismantling it with every order he gave. The Vistula-Oder offensive didn't just break the German army, it revealed that the command structure of the Third Reich had become a suicide pact. The final chilling transformation in the Führerbunker was not from confidence to despair, but from grand ambition to pure nihilism. The whispered admission, "The war is lost," was the last flicker of lucidity. What followed was a conscious embrace of destruction. The scorched earth decree, known as the Nero Order, was the ultimate proof. If the German people could not win him his empire, Hitler reasoned, they were unworthy of survival and deserved to be destroyed alongside their failing leader. He told Albert Speer, his armaments minister, that the war had proven the German people to be the weaker ones, and that the future belonged exclusively to the stronger Eastern nation. This philosophical shift had immediate and terrifying consequences. The focus was no longer on winning or even on managing a defense. It was on ensuring maximum destruction. The battle for Berlin was not a strategic maneuver. It was a theatrical finale, a Götterdämmerung orchestrated by Hitler himself. He deliberately delayed his own move to the capital, not for military reasons, but to make his final stand in the grand symbolic heart of the Reich. He poured the last of Germany's military potential, including old men from the Volkssturm and brainwashed children from the Hitler Youth, into a battle that was militarily hopeless from the start. He did this not to save Germany, but to serve as a human sacrifice to his own ego and his twisted historical narrative. The man who gathered his staff for his 56th and final birthday on April 20th, 1945, was a physical and psychological wreck, but his will to destroy remained intact. The military situation reports were now a litany of certain doom. The Americans at the Elbe, the Soviets in the suburbs of Berlin, the city completely encircled. Yet in these final hours, his delusions found their ultimate expression. He spoke of relief armies led by SS General Felix Steiner that existed only on paper. He interpreted the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg he had been waiting for, believing it would cause the Western alliance to collapse. Even with the Soviet artillery shaking the very foundations of his bunker, he clung to the belief that destiny would intervene. The moment of realization in January had been buried under a new, even more dangerous layer of fantasy. His final act, his suicide, was not an admission of defeat to the world, but his last, defiant act of control. He was not killed by the Soviets. He chose his own exit, ensuring he would never have to face the judgment of the reality he had spent years denying. The doom of Germany was not just a military outcome, it was the intended conclusion of its leader's final, furious descent into the abyss.